So firstly, I think, thank you for inviting us to speak at this event. It's an excellent piece of research, bringing together the issues around diet, consumption, climate change, and different climate scenarios. It is, of course, just a start, I think. I don't know if Tesco's are still in the room. Tesco's could just throw a few more £1 million into the research, I think, because what I'm going to talk about is there's many other aspects that, understandably, the research couldn't take into account at this stage. So what is cooking? It's a great title for a report. There is a big environmental crisis, and it's beyond climate change. We do have some significant social problems that have to be brought into the equation about how we look at what the UK consumes and how we consume. There's been some particularly unhelpful political responses in recent years that we need to be aware of and think about what the implications of those are for our diets and our consumption. But I think, as the report points, suggests to us, there is a clear way forward, I think, and I'll come on to that. I have been at Friends of the Earth 20 years. I'm still an optimist. Possibly, I don't know why, I am. But I do think there is still ways forward on some of these problems if we apply ourselves to them. So you won't be able to read this. Of course, I disobeyed every rule of doing a PowerPoint presentation. But I think you will have pen drives with it on. What I wanted to do is paint a picture of the broader problem that the report doesn't and cannot clearly, because it's only one piece of research to look at. In terms of soils, 25% of soils globally significantly degraded. So what does that mean in terms of how we take things forward? Water stress is a significant issue. The 2012 Water Stress Index suggested that very large swathes of important agricultural land in USA, China and India are at extreme risk. Clearly that's going to have impacts on global food production. We've talked a bit about extreme weather events. I think it is as much those extreme weather events, where they're prolonged droughts, or whether they are just more hot days, more cold days, and what that does in terms of seed viability and germination, etc., is something that we haven't really fully grasped yet. We eat quite a lot of food from the fish, and many people around the world are dependent on that for their protein. But ocean acidification is poorly understood yet. We don't really understand what impacts that might have on the marine ecosystem and food supply from food. We do know, of course, that our global fisheries are well overfished already. Over a third are now overexploited or collapsed. So there's another problem in terms of when we begin to identify what diets we might be able to eat, we need to take that into account. Clearly, the report did look at climate change, but I would also say biodiversity is an important component of stability within our ecosystems, and that includes the food which comes from our ecosystems. We know that the way that we've been farming in the UK and across the rest of Europe is having a significant negative impact on biodiversity, something like a 50% decline in farmland birds over the last 30 years. But there's increasingly research effort and research concern around, are there tipping points in biodiversity world, in the same way that we're beginning to try and grapple with climate tipping points. So when we look at what food systems we want to put forward, we have to take into account the need to look after our soils, the need to not deplete our water too much, the need to protect biodiversity as well. In terms of social problems, and again, many in the room will know more about this than I do, it's not just about providing lots of food. We know there are 1 billion people are hungry in the world at the moment, but there is enough food for everybody. We know that 178 million children under the age of 5 have stunted growth as a result of undernourishment. So we mustn't just talk about food supply and how do we increase food supply without recognising it isn't just food supply that gets food on people's tables. There are many other factors that need to get taken into account. When we look at our diets, we need to look at the obesity crisis. 1.5 billion people obese in the world. Food prices are soaring. That's clearly putting lots of families under strain, especially in developing countries, but even in countries like the UK. And increasingly, there's a strong correlation, at least, between food prices and conflict. And I was struck by this graph that was produced by New England Complex Systems in the States. Some research looking at food prices and conflict, and you can see the peaks of food prices, you had more conflict breaking out. And that intuitively seems right. If there are a lot of hungry people in your country, there's going to be more social unrest. So not only do we need to provide enough food for people, not only do we need to overcome the barriers that prevent people getting access to food, but we also need to keep an eye on what food prices are, because that can create some significant social unrest. And we know social unrest and conflict can have a bigger global impact. So these are many of the issues, of course, the report couldn't look at, but hopefully can be followed up in terms of further research. There are political responses as well to both climate change and food that we need to look at and be aware of, and think about what does that mean for the UK diet and how the UK adapts and responds to these challenges. There is a dash for biomass and biofuels, which we've seen. As an environmentalist, I was very keen on biofuels in the early days, and then I saw what the response of that was and what the impact has been. If all the global biofuel targets are met, it's predicted food prices could rise by additional 76% by 2020. We'll relate that back to poverty, hunger, and conflict, and the challenges that might create. We have renewable targets across Europe. Rightfully, we have renewable targets across Europe. The government's response to those renewable targets have largely been to say, OK, we're going to get a very, very significant amount of that from biomass because we think it's cheap and it's easy. But we know that biomass consumption can either drive off food production from land and replace it with biomass production. It can use some of the residues from crops, which may actually need to be ploughed back in the soil. So that's not a kind of a free lunch for the climate, residues from agriculture. Or it can directly impact on biodiversity by clearing biodiversity-rich forests and replacing with plantations. All of those things, I would suggest, are a problem. So there's a difficult political response that we need to grapple with and think about how these things add together. There is a limited amount of land on the planet, and there's been a large amount of food, land grabbing going on. I mean, it's under different terminologies. Fred Pearce, the writer for New Scientist, has just produced a new book on this, excellent new book, well worth reading. But there's been very large purchases of land within Africa and Asia by different investors. The Gulf states are a key one. You know, they've got severe water problems in their own countries in terms of producing their own food. So they're buying up other pieces of the land. Well, that land is going to produce the food they want, but that means there's also going to be less food on the food export markets. So we have a response in terms of our diet that says, actually, we're going to buy a lot of food into the UK. Then I think we might have some challenges and shocks ahead of us. And we know, of course, when food prices go up, many countries put in place export bans and restrictions. So that has something to say in terms of food availability and food security for countries like the UK. So where do we need to get to? And I don't think this is controversial at all, but it's incredibly challenging. What we need to do is we need to try and identify what are the diets and what are the agriculture that responds to the need for climate change, to reduce emissions in line with low amounts of climate change, that produces enough food so that people don't go hungry, and I don't think that's disputed anywhere, but also absolutely looks after our biodiversity, makes sure we don't have excess nitrogen running off into our seas and our rivers, looks after our soil and recognises the limits in terms of land availability. The UN came up with a new definition around sustainable diets. They've said that sustainable diets are those with low environmental impacts, contribute to food and nutrition security, respectful of biodiversity, economically fair and affordable, nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy. So if you like, that's the holy grail we need to aim towards. And as this report shows, even if you look particularly at the climate change aspect, that is challenging itself. Once we start to take into account those other aspects, how challenging is it? Can we meet that challenge? I think we can, and I think this research helps move in that direction. But clearly more research is needed and lots of societal debate, I think. So from Friends of the Earth's starting point, I mean, we need to digest this research this research a bit more fully and think about what it might mean for our work. But our starting point is we think you have to aim for 2 degrees or less if we can. I know one can easily be sceptical about any chance of achieving that, but we have to aim for it. But as the report makes clear, we absolutely have to also prepare for 4 degrees. Don't aim for it, but actually think about what it might be and begin preparing for it. We need to, this sounds off message, but it absolutely isn't, we need to look at producing our renewable electricity via our sun, sea, rivers, geothermal processes, wind, not looking at having very large amounts of land used to produce our electricity. That doesn't mean none, but we shouldn't go over the top in the way that the EU countries have done in terms of their renewable energy action plans. We do need changes in consumption. Clearly, this report identifies that if we want to look at a 2-degree scenario. We think perhaps that may, given the other contexts I've talked about, point to even a lower meat diet. And I like a pork pie as much as anybody. And we need to take into account and restore our fisheries, and that will take time. So in future, we may be able to get higher yields again from our seas, but not instantly. We need to stop expanding agriculture into biodiversity-rich areas. We do need to close the yield gaps while protecting soil and biodiversity. And there's increasing research, I think, and lots of debate still around this, but biodiversity-rich agriculture can have higher long-term yields, perhaps. We absolutely need to increase nutrient and water resource efficiency. I think the sense that farmers aren't using nitrogen very efficiently in many places because you've got large amounts of wash-off going to our rivers and seas clearly suggests, kind of more precision farming, drip irrigation is perhaps a sensible way forward. We absolutely need to reduce the amount of waste, both pre- and post-harvest, very large quantities there. Ensure that low-income people have access to seeds, food, etc. We do need to increase resilience to climate change as well within our crops, and we think that points towards kind of more agroecology approach, crop diversity, looking for orphan crops, those crops that perhaps haven't been used for whiles, as well as plant breeding has a key role there. And we think countries like the UK need to think about having a greater self-sufficiency in food for all the reasons I've talked about earlier. I think as we go forward, and I speak this largely from someone who's come from a climate and energy background over the last 10 years and stuff, we mustn't rely on technologies that may not happen. So lab meat, it may be a great idea if we can do it, but can we do it? GM with nitrogen fixing, and we organised a seminar at York University recently with some of the leading GM and other scientists. And there's a clear sense that this is perhaps decades away yet. It's incredibly complex. We may not be able to do it. And certainly we shouldn't be looking at kind of the more from our point of view, unsustainable large-scale monocultures that squeeze out biodiversity and often strip the soil of its wealth. So our initial thoughts on the report, very welcome. Chicken tikka masala, pasta and pesto and lab chops, their emissions are too high from our perspective. Mash and banger, we think, has an over-reliance of future technology. Too much fish because of what we talked about earlier, and possibly questionable biodiversity impacts. So we're kind of looking towards perhaps a bubble and squeak being the right path, perhaps a bit less meat. Some precision farming would be sensible. Clearly, if we can grow more food in our city centres, that makes sense. So something of a meld between some of these different scenarios, not surprisingly. We think that route might be good for biodiversity, soil resilience, and yields. Thank you very much.